Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. My name is Mike Traugott, and I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies. I want to welcome you to the 19th Miller-Converse Lecture, sponsored by the Center for Political Studies. This is a particularly bittersweet moment for me, and I know for many in the audience, because this is the first time we've had this event. And, excuse me, neither Warren nor Phil is present. Time is a relative concept, and many of us account for it in different ways. For me, I'm about to attend my 50th college reunion in May. And the significance of that is that I showed up in Ann Arbor just 2 or 3 weeks after I had graduated. I got steered to the University of Michigan late in my senior year after applying to law school that fall. I didn't have a fellowship, and I needed to get to work to start to earn money for my first semester. The first person I met in Ann Arbor was Don Stokes, because he was the main contact of my academic advisor. The second person I met was Kent Jennings, who's with us today, because he was my first employer. Eventually, I got to work with Warren for several years on a contract that he had to help ABC News with their election night coverage. And I traveled frequently to New York with Warren on primary and general election nights, sometimes with Jeff Miller and sometimes with Ray Howland. I met Phil during this period, and he became the chair of my dissertation committee. And I'll say more about that tomorrow. We in the Center for Political Studies developed this lecture series to honor Warren and Phil as the first two directors of the Center for Political Studies. In succession, they guided us and helped us grow in the first 16 years of our existence. Warren and Phil's contribution to the discipline of political science were truly monumental, extending far beyond the American voter. They both contributed to the establishment and sustenance of important social science institutions whose influence extended far beyond Ann Arbor. And we're all grateful for that as well. Let me say a couple of things about today's events and remind you about tomorrow's memorial service. After our speaker finishes his presentation and answering questions, we're going to have a brief ceremony unveiling 2 commemorative glass panels to honor Warren and Phil. This will include comments by their family members who are present. Tomorrow, there will be a memorial service in honor of Phil Converse to be held in the Michigan Union starting at 3 p.m. That'll be followed by a reception, and I hope that all of you will be able to attend. Now, let's turn to the lecture. Today, we're honored to have as our guest Jack Citrin, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science and director of the Institute of Governmental Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He has taught at Berkeley since 1969, and during that time, he's held administrative appointments as director of the State Data Program, acting director of the Survey Research Center, faculty athletics representative to the NCAA, and faculty director of the Berkeley Washington Program. His writings include The Politics of Disaffection Among Americans and British Youth, Tax Revolt, written with David Sears, How Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration Shaped the California Electorate, written with Ben Heighton, and Professor Citrin's latest book, also co-authored with David Sears, is American Identity and the Politics of Multiculturalism, which was published last year by Cambridge University Press. Today, Jack is going to be talking about that area of his research in his presentation entitled Identities and Identifications in American Public Opinion. Please welcome Jack Citrin.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that generous introduction. Isaac Newton famously stated, "If I have seen farther, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." So I make no claim to having seen farther, but I do know that all of us who study public opinion stand on the shoulders of Warren Miller and Philip Converse. They are the giants who built the intellectual and institutional foundations on which the work of generations of scholars stand. The American voter, elections and the political order, of time and partisan stability, constituency influence in Congress, these are just a few of the markers that to this day guide research on civic competence and democratic accountability. On a personal note, Warren's prescience in inserting a political trust measure into the 1958 election study provided me the data that launched my career and kept me going for 10 years. As for Phil, let me quote verbatim a question I pose every year on the qualifying PhD exam in political behavior for Berkeley graduate students. Let me quote, "Every word Converse writes in the nature of belief systems in mass publics is the truth, even the commas and the semicolons." So I'm really humbled and honored by this invitation to deliver the Miller-Converse Lecture. And I'm especially pleased, truly pleased, to be back here at this great university. Sitting in the audience, making me nervous, is my niece Genevieve, who's about to get her master's degree from the Ford School. Her sister preceded her, and her father and her mother also have assorted Michigan degrees. So I'll just start with Go Blue. Let me begin more seriously. Balancing unity and diversity is an exacting task. Indeed, the scholar of nationalism, Ernest Gellner, proclaimed the multi-ethnic nation is an oxymoron. To many current commentators, fragmentation rather than unity is the trajectory of American society, and the effort to realize a pluribus unum in the United States has faltered. Examining these claims through the study of public opinion has been really the leitmotif of my recent research, much of which is joint work with David Sears. So why would one think that a pluribus unum is in trouble? America has always been both ethnically diverse and unusually patriotic. True, from 1790 to 1965, the definition of American identity was contested between something I call cosmopolitan liberalism, which held that anyone could belong to America, provided they endorsed the country's democratic principles, and nativism, which maintained that only certain white Anglo-Protestant groups could be truly American. I think it's safe to say that in the 1960s, cosmopolitan liberalism triumphed in law, but then quickly faced a challenge from multiculturalism, a new ideological approach to the dilemmas of diversity. This challenge derived from the twinned revolutions of civil rights and immigration reform. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated the legal basis for racial discrimination and provided, formally at least, full citizenship for Black Americans. The Civil Rights Revolution also triggered the spread of what I call imitative identity politics, the demand for greater equality and recognition through group-conscious policies by other newly mobilized groups. At the same time, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 ended the Eurocentric national origins quotas established in 1924 and made family reunification a priority in allocating visas. The unanticipated result was a wave of Hispanic and Asian immigration that, as we know, has shaped the country's ethnic makeup and provided new constituencies for ideological multiculturalism. The foreign-born share of the U.S. population rose from 4.7% in 1960 to 13% in 2010. So the broadening sweep of identity politics and the steady increase in the racial, ethnic, and religious diversity of American society coincided, some might say spawned, multiculturalism as a new approach to coping with ethnic diversity. At its core, this ideology elevates the significance of ethnicity relative to nationality. By emphasizing the government's obligation to maintain cultural differences, strong multiculturalists often speak of the United States as a nation of nations, each with equal rights. So in this image of America, the unum fades and a pluribus plures becomes a new acceptable reality. So what are the consequences of these changes in demography and political culture for American public opinion? Has identity politics, by emphasizing the priority of pursuing in-group interests and legitimizing a politics of difference, actually weakened Americans' commitment to a common national identity? To address this very broad issue, I consider three empirical questions specifically. First, is attachment to America waning due to the rising psychological significance of subnational identities, particularly among minority groups and immigrants? In other words, are strong ethnic and national identities conflictual, as Samuel Huntington gloomily asserted when he deemed Hispanic immigration the greatest current threat to American unity, or are these identities complementary? Second, is the normative content of American identity, how people define what it means to be an American, contested along ethnic group lines, and do alternative conceptions of American identity influence policy preferences? And third, are American and ethnic identities now linked to what we know is the main fault line in contemporary politics, partisan polarization? So I shall briefly compare, using, I promise, primitive statistics, the opinions of white, black, and Latinos. I use Hispanic and Latinos interchangeably here, in both national surveys and surveys conducted by David Sears and myself in Los Angeles. Those surveys typically have included greater numbers of minorities, including non-citizens Latinos. Unfortunately, I should say, all of these surveys include too few Asian Americans respondents to be able to include them in the analysis. So before I turn to the data, let me just say a few words about how I understand the concepts of identities and identity politics. Okay? National and ethnic identities are among the multiple ways people can liken or contrast themselves with others. As with party identification, a familiar concept here, these identities have cognitive, affective, and normative dimensions. The act of self-categorization answers the cognitive, who am I question, but the strength of one's identification, the emotional significance of one's membership in that group varies. Identification as is not the same as identification with. One can easily call oneself an American without being very patriotic. So it is the strength of identifying with, I think, that generally spurs political action. Then to the normative dimension. The normative dimension of an identity returns to the physical features, values, and conduct thought to be characteristic of the prototypical member of a group. Historians cull a nation's unique identity from the pronouncements of leaders, from laws, literature, cultural symbols, and customary behavior. So from a subjective perspective, when people contemplate the constitutive norms of America, they are thinking about what makes someone an American and what should make them an American. And I want to emphasize that these norms can be more or less inclusive, and they also may be more or less contested, with established criteria for membership, say those defined by ethnicity in the nativist version, coming under attack from people of different backgrounds. Finally, the existence of multiple identities can raise the problem of prioritization. There can be occasions when these national and subgroup identifications tug in opposite directions. Of obvious political relevance in these situations is which loyalty people put first. My favorite example is that after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans faced a choice between commitment to their new country and support for the co-ethnics of their country of origin. Overwhelmingly, they demonstrated the primacy of their American national identity. So, identity politics refers to efforts to advance or defend a group's symbolic and material standing. With numerous identity groups behaving in this way, official actions tend to be judged largely from the angle of group pride, and this is one reason that the critics that I mentioned earlier argue that the spread of identity politics is undermining national cohesion. So let me now turn to the data. And I'll start with attachment to the idea of attachment to America. This is from the 2012 American National Election Studies. This study asked respondents separate questions about the importance of being American and of being a member of your ethnic group to, quote, your identity. Okay? So these questions can be taken as indicators of who am I, self-categorization. So attachment to America clearly is a salient factor for identity formation in all three ethnic groups, although it seems more important slightly for whites than for the other two groups. There, however, is clear evidence of by contrast, if you look at the concept of ethnicity, it's far less important in the self-concept of whites, perhaps because they conflate their own background with an American identity. There is, however, clear evidence of strong group consciousness among the black respondents, who are far more likely than other groups to stress the importance of their ethnicity. Turning briefly to the Los Angeles data on ethnic consciousness, and don't have to pay too much attention to the details here, but let me quickly talk about this. The Los Angeles data confirm the national data, but they also show that among Latinos, a strong sense of ethnic identification is related to their immigrant status. In those surveys, we asked people how strongly they identified with their co-ethnics, how important their ethnicity was to their sense of identity, and how often they thought of themselves as a member of their ethnic group. We then combined these into an index, that's the far column on the right, with scores ranging from 0 to 3. Okay? Okay. Whites again express the weakest level of ethnic consciousness, and Latinos in this case the highest. But this is a reflection of the fact that most in the Los Angeles samples were foreign-born non-citizens. On another question, which we don't show here, blacks were most likely to say that members of their group had experienced discrimination in the United States. Among Latinos, this sense of grievance declined with tenure in the United States and with whether or not they were born in the United States. So to this, if you apply the assimilationist model of gradual integration over time, it suggests that other things being equal, the sense of ethnic consciousness among Latinos declines over time. Okay. As one might expect, the importance of self-categorization as an American is positively correlated with patriotism. But again, this is most true among whites. Let me turn to this next slide. Okay. Patriotism essentially is love of country and love of a pride in country, and it measures the affective component of national identity. Okay. This is again from the 2012 National Election Study, And you find that positive feelings far outnumber negative sentiments when respondents were asked about their love for America and how they felt when they saw the flag flying. In his essays, Duties, Cicero wrote, "The Republic should be the most cherished thing." Apparently, many Americans still feel this way. Although whites were most positive, in all three ethnic groups, a large majority said that they, quote, loved America. The flag, a ubiquitous symbol of nationhood, similarly elicited positive mentions, although less so among blacks. And this gap actually on the flag, racial gap, has appeared in earlier studies as well. Still, this evidence regarding pervasive patriotism is consistent with a wide array of earlier data. For example, the 2004 national election study conducted in the midst of an increasingly unpopular war found that 91% of whites, 81% of blacks, and 91% of Latinos said their love for America was extremely or very strong. So this emotional attachment remains strong. Okay? As one might expect, the importance of identifying yourself, self-categorization as an American, is positively associated with patriotism among all groups. But again, there is a relationship, a more stronger relationship among whites. Now, this is a pretty ugly slide, I warn you in advance. So I've circled the more important kinds of correlations, okay? And among all groups, and the importance of a national, the importance of self-categorization as an American is positively associated with patriotism. Okay, again, among all groups, the importance of saying you're an American and your ethnic identification also are positively associated. And this correlation is strongest among blacks, which I take as another indication of much research showing a distinctively strong sense of group consciousness among black Americans. Okay? The importance of ethnicity, ethnic identification to patriotism is there, but it's much weaker. But the important point I want to make here, given my thesis, is that there's no evidence that ethnic identification among minority groups and attachment to America collide. Will this pattern of attachment endure? Potential change, it seems, comes not from the influx of immigrants, but from generational differences. Here are 4 generational cohorts with General Y, the so-called millennials, born after 1980, Generation X, 1964 to 80, the boomers, the pre-boomers, whom I like to call the greatest generation since I belong to it. But these data shows a decline in the importance of Americanism for one's identity and less consistent patriotism among the youngest group. This trend actually appears in all 3 ethnic groups, suggesting that intergenerational change may ultimately reduce the group differences that I've been talking about earlier. Let me now turn to what I call identity choice, that is, prioritization of the nation or the ethnic group. Now, all nationalists insist on the priority of identification with the nation over all other affiliations. In ethnically homogeneous societies, like Japan, nationality and ethnicity completely overlap. So the possibility that these identities clash is moot. Here, of course, the situation is more complex, particularly for groups that do not belong to the nation's historical core. So when the chips are down, how do Americans prioritize national and ethnic identities? So the available data from the NES and then from our Los Angeles studies provide 2 approaches to measurement, and happily the results converge. In the 2012 election studies, pretty easy simply to subtract what we saw earlier, the respondents' comment about how important ethnicity is to her identity and the American Americanism importance score. So in all three groups, if you look at that, just a small minority prioritize ethnicity. Whites stand apart, however, from blacks and to a lesser extent from Latinos in how much more importance they attribute to self-categorize themselves as American. That's that 65% there. Among blacks, a large majority, 63%, give the two dimensions of identity equal importance, and this is true of 47% of Latinos. Here, too, we have evidence of assimilation, because if you look at the different generations of Hispanics or Latinos in this study, that 51% among the third generation shows the increasing prioritization of Americanism over ethnicity. Okay. In the Los Angeles data, the indicator of identity choice is a little different. There we ask people, when you think of social and political issues, do you think of yourself as a member of a particular ethnic, racial, and nationality group, or do you think of yourself as, quote, just an American? In this dichotomous format, the just American response is the overwhelming choice, although there is some variation by ethnicity. But this dichotomous question doesn't allow for the familiar strategy that we know of calling oneself a hyphenated American or having a dual identity. So several of our Los Angeles studies included a follow-up question allowing respondents to say, which of the following is most true for you? Just an American or both? Just American or both America and your ethnicity? Given this opportunity, most whites didn't take it. Among the minority groups, by contrast, the dual hyphenated identity became the majority choice. A substantial minority of blacks did not budge from the just an American group. So if one adds this to the 55% who adopted for the dual identity, it seems clear that relatively few blacks are denying a sense of identification with the nation as a whole. What W.E.B. Du Bois called the double consciousness of being black and being American remains the modal identity choice for this group. Among Hispanics, there's something of a reversal of the pattern of identity choice. Here, just one-third opted for the solely ethnic identity choice, and only 11% of the total said they feel themselves to be just an American. But again, identity choice is a function of immigrant status, okay? And among the native-born, an American identity, 25%, outstrips a purely ethnic identity, while the opposite holds true for the foreign-born. So this implies, again, that for today's immigrants, the hyphenated or dual identity may be a kind of a halfway house in terms of social identity, much as was the case for earlier European newcomers in the equivalent stage of assimilation. So, back to the question of do national and ethnic identities collide? Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Samuel Huntington, many other famous writers have warned about the risks of giving in to identity politics and institutionalizing diversity through group-conscious policies. Huntington, in particular, believed that strong ethnic identities of immigrants are likely to persist rather than weaken with time, further compromising national unity. Predicting the future, of course, is a dangerous business, but I must say that these warnings do not jive with the evidence being reviewed here. In the 2012 National Election Study, once again, this is a relationship between that prior choice between ethnic and national identity, which is more important, and a score on a patriotism index, which merely combined the questions of love of America and feeling good about the flag and scoring it from 0 to 1. So you see all these high numbers to begin with, but once again you see that among those who have a dual identification, patriotism is high, and again those who who prioritize national identity have higher patriotism scores. Okay, so the relative importance of being an American as compared to one's ethnicity is associated with greater patriotism. And this is the Los Angeles data, and just look at that right-hand column. You see what is most compelling there is that among blacks and Latinos, the patriotic sentiments of the just American and the both American and ethnic groups are very similar. And these results actually are confirmed by elaborate multivariate analyses, which I decided to spare you from. So more generally, allegiance to the nation seems not to be diminished by retaining a hyphenated ethnic American self-categorizations. Okay? And numerous surveys over 20 years using multiple indicators of both attitudes confirm that there is no such clash between ethnic identification and patriotism. I want to highlight one deviant finding out of the sort of 22 separate studies that I reviewed. Okay. Among blacks and Latinos, tellingly, the only case where there's a significant negative relationship between ethnic identification, or what we call ethnic consciousness, and patriotism occurred when the indicator of ethnic identification was a question about the extent of discrimination against one's own group. And that, I think, is something I will come back to. Okay, let me turn now to the normative content of American identity. There are two leading ideal types of nations in the scholarly literature: the ethnic nation, with membership based on the principle of descent, and the more inclusive civic nation, with membership based on the acceptance of fundamental political principles and institutions. The dominant view of Tocqueville, Hartz, Myrdal, among many other writers about America, is that this is a civic nation with acceptance of the creed of individualism, equality of opportunity, freedom, and constitutionalism, a sufficient condition for inclusion. But Roger Smith at Penn, among others, has forcefully argued that this image overlooks both the historical exclusion of racial minorities from full citizenship and nativist reactions against immigrants. And he spells out an alternative ethnocultural tradition in American political culture. So what does the data show? For better or worse, in 1990, I invented the most common technique for measuring subjective conceptions of American identity. This is a survey question asking people to rate the importance of certain factors in making someone a, quote, true American. This measure has now been used by numerous scholars on both American and European publics, and although the specific factors asked about sometimes vary, the results are pretty consistent. Repeatedly, the civic elements of American identity are widely endorsed and are likely to be seen as more important than ascriptive norms such as nativity or being a Christian. So in red there are the so-called ethnic criteria, in blue the leading civic criteria, and then the others are the frequently asked also as what makes someone a true, or how important is this for making someone a true American. Okay. When ancestry is included in this list of attributes, just a tiny minority of whites say it's important. Speaking English, as you can see, is considered very important, but my view, and I differ in this from other people, I don't regard this as, quote, an ethnic norm, rather an essential and learnable skill that facilitates full participation in the country's political and economic life. And I'll just, if you look towards the end, the last column here, the far right, is the dominance of the civic conception appears even more clearly when we ask people to rank which is the most important criterion, rather than simply rate the importance of particular attributes of norms for Americanism. So respect for equal treatment, respect for institutions, equal treatment, 29 and 20 dominate the nativist, Christian, and born in America choices. Okay? Finally, our own research and the research of others, such as Deborah Schildkraut, show that variation in beliefs about American identity tend to be better explained by age, education, and political ideology than by race or ethnicity. Okay? Ethnic cleavages on the content of American identity are relatively minor. So, what are the political consequences of a strong sense of national identity? In a wide-ranging recent review of research, Deborah Schildkraut writes, and let me quote from her summary, "People who say that being American is very important to them are generally more likely to say they have obligations to help their fellow Americans, to be proud of the country's achievements, to pay more attention to politics, to be more politically active, to trust the judicial system, and to support international cooperation over militarism." That all sounds good. However, they are also more likely to endorse an ethnic version of Americanism, to be unwilling to spend more money to help minorities, and to deny basic rights to people who, quote, disagree with America. It's another side of the ledger. Whether one conceives of Americanism in ethnic or civic terms also matters. My former students, Matthew Wright, Morris Levy, and I showed that ranking ethnic norms more highly was opposed to immigration, views immigration as a threat. It prefer immigrants who speak English over those with greater skill and education, and desire that minorities assimilate into the mainstream culture rather than maintaining their own customs, and also there's more support for protectionism. So the normative content, the belief, the subjective concept of Americanism obviously matters for public policy. So I'm going to turn briefly to the third main empirical question, the linkage of national and ethnic identities to partisanship and policy. And here I think nothing is very surprising. Looking first at self-categorization among blacks and Latinos, but not among whites, those for whom ethnicity is important in defining their identity are more likely to identify as Democrats. By contrast, the importance of being an American for one's identity is associated with a Republican identification in all ethnic groups. I would say, however, that these differences are not huge. Okay? Patriotism is associated with a Republican affiliation, again, primarily among whites. The correlations in national samples were 0.7 in 1992, 0.27 in the 2004 election study, and 0.15 in this latest 2012. And a finer-grained analysis shows that political orientations or party identifications also divide people over attachment to such national symbols as the flag and the anthem, with Republicans and conservatives more devoted. Republicans are also more likely to endorse most of the ethnic norms for Americanism and the policy preferences associated with this perspective. Though here too the differences among partisans sometimes are not that wide. So finally, how do national and ethnic identifications affect preferences on current issues? With this last slide, what this shows is the unstandardized regression coefficients for analysis of the policy preferences done by ethnic group. And so there are a series of issues, an economic issues index, a cultural issues index, then immigration, and another question about how hawkish you are on policy toward Iran. Okay? So strong sense, let me just focus on the more interesting results. A strong sense of American identity is positively rated in all groups to opposition to immigration and a hawkish policy towards Iran, even after controlling for party identification. As for the role of ethnic identification, the effects are more complex. When ethnicity matters to one's self-concept, there's a push towards a more liberal view on economic issues among all groups. A little surprising for the white group, don't really know what that is about. Among blacks and whites, ethnic identification increases opposition to immigration, and I think this is a significant finding for blacks. Whereas among Latinos, this attitude predictably has the opposite effect, so that strong ethnic identification makes you more pro-immigration. Okay. So as for patriotism, and that's the bottom row in each one of these categories here. As for patriotism, it is, of course, unsurprisingly associated with hawkish preferences in dealing with Iran, but also with opposition to immigration. So I hope I can be forgiven here for eliding issues of omitted variables, endogeneity, and various other methodological faux pas that the graduate students in the audience are counting up as we speak. And let me just venture a conclusion regarding the linkages between attachment to America and policy preferences. In the domains of us and them, insiders and outsiders, a stronger American identity goes together with a harder exclusionary line. And in other research, David Sears and I also found that the stronger one's feelings of patriotism, the more likely one was to oppose race-conscious policies, liberal immigration policies, and bilingual education, all policies with minority constituencies. So group-conscious policies, where national and ethnic identities do clash, and where how one defines membership in the national community matters. So for those policies. As for the balance of public opinion, Americans generally oppose institutionalizing group rights through policies that create communal representation. At the same time, proposals to celebrate cultural diversity and incorporate ethnic traditions into the broader culture are unproblematic to most. Many Americans view cultural assimilation and cultural pluralism as compatible. So let me take stock and try and finish quickly. Despite the alleged inroads of globalization, it remains true, I think, that in most of the world, the nation is the largest community, which when push comes to shove, effectively commands people's loyalty. In divided societies, an overarching common attachment to the nation can promote group cooperation and mutual acceptance. The catalyst for the research referred here was the claim that heightened ethnic consciousness among minority groups, along with the immigration of Latinos and Asians, would weaken attachment to America and erode national unity. Okay. What did the evidence show? Very briefly, all the main groups claim that being American is very important in how they view their identity. Ethnicity matters too, but far less for whites, a larger and more diverse group than for blacks in particular, or for Latinos. Okay. Patriotism also is pervasive in all three groups, but somewhat less among blacks. So there is indeed evidence as what has been called black exceptionalism in terms of a higher level of group consciousness. Among Latinos, the pattern is quite consistent with the process of assimilation. Ethnic identification weakens and attachment to America increases according to one's immigrant status. So numerous surveys show that ethnic identifications and attachment to America do not collide, but rather are complementary. For a clash among these identities to emerge, there must be circumstances that raise their salience in a visibly competitive manner, and I think these situations may be relatively rare. In a diverse society, only an inclusive civic conception of nationhood can be unifying in the long run. Clearly, most Americans now do favor a civic rather than an ethnic definition of Americanism. But to be sure, a nativist residue remains. But disagreement among the meaning of American identity and differences in support for traditional symbol of nationhood do not follow on ethnic lines. This analysis of the balance of national and ethnic loyalties has portrayed a rosier future for American unity than the worrisome scenario envisaged by many conservatives and liberals alike. But it would be naive to conclude that there is no serious challenge to the ideal of a pluribus unum. The continuing significance of race in disadvantaging blacks in daily life remains the main sore, and Ferguson and its aftermath have laid this issue bare. The failure to achieve greater equality of opportunity for minorities increases the incentives for elites to mobilize support on the base of group identity and thereby to accentuate an us versus them mentality. On immigration and other issues relating to national identity, competing visions of America seem to be increasingly tied to party identification. In my view, an undesirable prospect. If the Republicans become an all-white party and the meanings of Americanism become more tightly linked to party affiliation, the foundations of national unity surely become shakier. So inequality and party polarization rather than immigration are the main threats to mutuality and cohesion. On the positive side of the ledger, beyond the inter-ethnic consensus on many abstract values and symbols, the steady increase in intermarriage between members of different ethnic groups and cohort replacement should reduce intergroup tensions and enhance commitment to the civic conception of national identity. Now, chronic optimism may be an unwarranted feature of America's national character. Still, as one looks to the future, the evidence of public opinion is that American identity is not so much waning as changing in tone. The success of the civil rights movement and the spread of egalitarian norms have put nativist and white supremacist views increasingly on the defensive. The linguistic and political assimilation immigrations suggest that the specter of ethnic balkanization in America is a chimera, and that a high level of patriotism will endure. So let me conclude with this. Don't throw away your flag just yet.